Obviously, this has been the biggest topic of discussion in UK politics, coming up to the referendum and after it. We decided not to write a paper on one side of the argument or the other. There is a box in the paper that summarises arguments Christians used during the referendum, including me. So I was able to sneak one talk through on a website to a church before the referendum, because I have to be careful, because I was still on the IMF's books, about how much publicity I gave to my views on the subject. So it wasn't a paper designed to sort of give one side of the argument to the other. It was trying to say, how should Christians now react to the potential disrupted relationships that are on three different planes as a result of Brexit. So Remain versus Leave in the UK, UK versus EU 27, and then within the rest of the EU, both within countries that are often deeply divided about integration versus nation-state supporters, and then within those countries themselves. So that was the motivation of the paper, rather than is Brexit a good idea or not from a Christian perspective. We had written a paper on is the euro a good idea in 1998, and you can get from that quite a lot of the tone of argument that we would have used if we were just addressing the question. So that's what we're trying to do. Mike's now just going to take over, and because this is going to be a tag team effort, just talk a bit about the motivation for peace building.
Yeah, so Paul and I both met around the dining room table with Julian Rivers and Roy Clements and a number of other people when we started this off originally. I think it was 1989, and a couple of years later we decided we would move to trying to put out something every 3 months. So that was a step change from where we started, which was just sort of informal discussions and gatherings, and then somebody started writing something down before the papers, and then it gradually morphed into doing these papers more formally. And then we managed to drag in Dennis and some others, and the thing gradually got more gravitas, and we've moved on from there. We had Mike Ovey, and a whole group of very interesting people have written for Cambridge Papers over the years. And I'm delighted to tell you there's Bible study groups in Oxford who study Cambridge Papers. So the underlying motivations of this paper are, in my mind, the fact that you've got this enormous division right down the sort of centre of Europe between those who want closer union in the sense of moving towards a single federal state, and those who are now panicking about where that's taking them and where it leads. So you see the French election coming up, no one's quite sure what's going to happen. Almost certainly those who want the EU to stay in place will win, but the very fact that there can be a significant question mark over that, I think should cause everyone for some concern. And you even have the EU threatening Poland and Hungary that if they don't take down their barriers, keeping migrants out, then they're going to have to leave the EU. So I don't know how that's going to play out, but it's a very tense period. Now, from a Christian point of view, I'm sure all of you in this room will be aware of our fundamental proposition that Christianity is fundamentally about relationships, that the relationships in the Trinity predate creation itself, and that every part of Christianity, our concept of God, our concept of what sin is as a breakdown of relationship, the concept of covenant as a long-term committed relationship, above all Christ as the ultimate relational person who redefines poverty in relational terms as well, and the cross as not a military event or a political event, but as a relational event. It's not about winning some huge victory somewhere. It is about resolving the problems of broken relationships between God and humanity and between people and people. So these relational propositions lie at the very heart of who Christians are and what they believe. And therefore, when you get an enormous amount of friction and conflict and even hatred, visceral hatred, between people on both sides of a political divide, then Christians should be waking up and saying, this is really important. And you may have millions of people on each side of that divide across Europe now. So as Christians, we are obviously committed to evangelism, because evangelism is restoring people's relationship with God himself. But we can't do that on the one hand and ignore the second commandment about the relationships that people have with their neighbours. And this paper is trying to address the question, how as Christians can we build relationships as peacemakers across this terrible divide across the central of Europe and across our own society here in Britain, where the Remainers and the Exeteers are still at each other's throats. And those who wish to remain will do everything they can to obstruct where Brexit is going. That there's this kind of visceral hatred that I think is the most disturbing thing, and which Christians must find a way to address. So this paper is trying to address that question.
So we, in the paper, just briefly go through what can be done to try and heal relationships across those divides. We debated putting in one or two comments about what's driving those concerns. We got a bit of pushback, particularly from Dennis, when I put in the point about the weeks after the referendum, sort of gave a hint what it would feel like in a civil war. Now, being a veteran of Lebanon, it was sort of, you ain't seen anything yet like a civil war. But to me, it was just that sort of total incomprehension that people in the same country could think so totally differently. I think that's part of a reflection of what's going on in higher income countries, whereby people are self-selecting towards hearing opinions, befriending people who just think like them, reading the same social media, the same television stations or newspaper comment columns. And because we're not mixing in wider community, in extended family, in churches, and coming across people of different ages, different backgrounds, different perspectives, we seem to be becoming more and more incomprehensible about anyone who could think differently from me, because we're not coming across those people enough. And so this isn't just a UK issue, this is particularly in the US, you're seeing a much deeper divide politically within the society. And so there are concerns going forward just about social integration and unity. How can people disagree peaceably with one another? And I think from the UK context, the EU issue touches a nerve that crosses normal political boundaries, in that it sort of speaks to a question of, how do I think the world should be governed? Can we be optimistic enough about human nature to believe a transnational institution is viable or workable? Or do I believe that the nation state should be where ultimate decisions are made, and that going beyond that is very dangerous? And so it seems the question rouses such debate and sort of emotions, because it seems to touch more of an identity question about how do I wish the world to be and how do I think it should be governed, and hence we have these sort of deep divisions. So I think on the three dimensions of relationships that are under stress, I'll just very briefly talk about the first two, and then Michael will wax lyrical on how to reform Europe going forward. I think just from a sort of assessing the sweep of history and God's design in this, whether you agree from a Christian perspective or not, whether it was a good idea or not, certainly what seems to have happened as a result is that the EU now knows that it cannot go sort of progress full steam towards a federal state. Now, before the referendum, just about everyone in the UK agreed the EU needed reform, but nobody could understand how to bring it about. Since the referendum, and one country deciding to leave, that has sort of put a lot of pause on the whole sort of federalising agenda. And even though the Commission recently admitted, of course, that's what it wants, it put out a white paper saying these are the 5 options of how to take the EU going forward. It would never have done that at the 60th anniversary of the Treaty of Rome without Brexit. So in one sense, this is being used as the catalyst for wider EU reform, but before the referendum we couldn't understand how it could possibly come about. So just then, steps on UK Remainer Leaver reconciliation. I think, as the paper just says, and some of these are sort of gradually happening. So we were drafting in sort of December, January. So some of these have happened. Sort of general acceptance of the result, even though they were sort of as being on one side. I'm sort of quite surprised that there wasn't a hurdle on you needed 55% or 60%. Parliament seemed to have been quite careless in the referendum bill, not thinking that there was any real chance that it could be passed. And so there wasn't any sort of real thinking about hurdle rates of majority that you needed to take such a big step. I think there needs to be acceptance of that there is a principled case on both sides. Often this problem of the other tribe is sort of motivated by the wrong things has gripped the public debate, and we have to accept that on both sides there are principled reasons why you could vote one way or the other. And just to sort of say, oh, prejudice or xenophobia on one side, transnational optimism on the other side, shouldn't necessarily sort of generate that. Then acceptance that there was exaggeration, if not downright fabrication on both sides. The leavers were way too sort of optimistic about how much money would be released, particularly when they were promising it to multiple audiences, and were perhaps optimistic about how difficult a process leaving would be. Remainers were categorically wrong in their predictions of what would happen on a leave vote, and various certainly exaggerated forecasts were given, various broken commitments were given. So if you remember, Mr. Cameron said he would not resign on a leave vote a week before the vote. A week later he did resign. So various issues around commitments and promises broken. Needs to be a rejection of xenophobia and isolationism in this process. Clearly on the Leave side there were effectively 2 camps. There's the internationalist side who sees Brexit as a way to enhance relationships with the Commonwealth and the United States in particular, whereas there's a wing that is more sort of, yes, this gives us an opportunity to restrict migration from around the world, not just the EU. So there has to be care there. And we flag up the role of churches in reconciling leavers and remainers in the UK. There are 1 or 2 Christian groups starting to promote dialogues within churches, but churches themselves can do some of that. Then on relational peace building between the UK and the rest of the EU27, we just flag up that there are big challenges for the EU itself to negotiate anything in this space, because there are so many institutions with a veto. So you have 27 member states and their parliaments, you have the European Parliament itself, and then you have at least 10 regional parliaments, each of whom can veto the deal. So the whole fracas about Gibraltar just highlights that actually Spain itself can just halt any process whatsoever. This is why it's going to be very difficult to bring a deal to the table, and why it's going to be difficult for the EU side to make many concessions, because of the concerns that if it's too easy, other people, other nations will think the same way. My candidate for next leaver would probably be Hungary, but under the current leadership. Then on the EU side, need for understanding of the UK's position. The UK has historically been very lukewarm about EU membership, initially restrained from entry by President de Gaulle in the 50s and 60s. There's certainly, from my parents' generation, who was Eurosceptic but voted in favour of remaining in the referendum in 1975, a sense of betrayal by the political establishment, and that this was recompense for being misled in the referendum in 1975. They were told that this was purely an economic customs union, no political integration, etc., and feel the sense of being lied to then. You have to remember that there is a very large visible trade deficit that the UK runs with the EU. Hence, without a deal, there will be significant losers on the EU side. And the four freedoms that are much talked about, goods, trade, services, trade, mobility, and capital, these are not indivisible, either in EU history, nor in theory, or in practice. So these four freedoms are restrained even now in practice. So Germans are not allowed to buy land in large quantities in Poland because this was being done early on and the Polish government stopped it. There are restraints on capital freedom. So to sort of say, oh, this must be inviolable, there is nothing else negotiable, is naive. There needs to be early assurances over positions of citizens in each other's countries. And Christians need to be building contacts now and promoting missionary activity onto continental Europe whilst there is still freedom of movement. This is one of the concerns about how is the continental Europe to be re-evangelized when there is more restriction on movement from the UK. So those are some of the steps on trying to rebuild relationships, EU, UK. Michael.
So it falls to me just to mention in very general terms what kind of way forward we envisage for the EU as a whole. So I just wanted to mention just two or three main points as the time is short, and I know Jonathan will be delighted if I can be short. If there's going to be a possible way forward for Europe to bring the two sides of the debate together, the integrationists and the separatists, we believe that the first step has got to be to define a common culture or ideology, if you like, for Europe, which in geopolitical terms gives it some distinctive identity. One of the major problems we believe in Europe is that, apart from this emphasis on economic growth and so on, Europe lacks a shared sense of identity now, particularly between Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and Western Europe, if you like, from Germany west. We've suggested in the paper, again, as you might expect coming from our stable, that this emphasis on putting relationships at the heart of public policy, whether that's in finance or business or education or healthcare or criminal justice, potentially provides a shared way forward that resonates with its Judeo-Christian roots. So whereas the Lisbon Treaty very heavily ruled out a link to the Christian past and insisted that it could only be related to the Enlightenment, we're suggesting, no, let's go the other route and say, look, these Christian roots are very strong in Europe and across Europe, whether it's east, south, or west, and let's say, look at how that Christian heritage and foundation could be articulated today in the way you run your economic system and your educational system and so on. And that would give Europe a very distinctive place in the world and a very distinctive identity. We see the EU as a little bit like a ship on a slipway that has come from the construction shipyards and is halfway down the slipway towards the sea, and suddenly, as we're going halfway down, it screeches to a halt because there's suddenly a huge amount of resistance from people who don't want it to go the whole way. They're suddenly scared about what a full federal government in Europe might look like, what it might do, what it would be characterized by. Could this be a fascist government, for example? What would it look like? And also, you've got these enormous divisions within Europe. So you've got the problem that Paul gave me this estimate from McKinsey's, I think it was, that through a fixed exchange rate mechanism of the euro, roughly 1.5 trillion euros, that's $1,500 billion, has been transferred from Southern Europe to Northern Europe. These are huge amounts of funds, and they're going on flowing ever faster from the south to the north. So I think I'm right in saying that Italy's lost about half its exports over the last 15 years. Does that sound about right? It's some very substantial figure. Let's leave aside the exact amount, but it's a very substantial amount. And equally, of course, you see Greece trying to escape from the euro net, but not able to do that, not being allowed to do that. But the problem is, if you've got this enormous flow of resources from Southern Europe to Northern Europe through this economic mechanism, then you are creating a huge amount of hatred in Southern Europe, particularly obviously in Greece, but also in some other Southern European countries towards Northern Europe, and especially Germany, which is a harbinger of bad things, I think, to come. So our solutions lie in giving greater flexibility to the relationships that each of the countries in the EU has with one another and with the centre. So trying to insist that we should all go down one route and move towards a federal government doesn't fit comfortably with many of the countries in the EU. A single currency, pooling tax receipts, a single budget, joint debt issuance, all of these things may be fine for a small group of countries at the heart of the EU, but it's certainly not fine for the whole of the 27 countries. So there needs to be some flexibility, and countries need to be able to have their own policies around immigration, mobility of labour, welfare systems, and so on, if they wish to. So one's looking at a multi-level approach, I think. And I think something else that comes through very strongly in the paper, which Paul and I agree on strongly, is that there has to be an end to the steadily increasing levels of national and corporate and personal debt. Obviously, the debt is growing enormously fast as a consequence of the euro, because the only way the southern European countries can survive is by borrowing more and more, and they're already bankrupt in a way that, in a sense, mean they can never repay the debts they now have. But we have to stop this growth of the debt, and that we don't see any way to do that than to allow countries to leave the euro, and ultimately we believe the euro itself should be cancelled, because the euro is resulting in this enormous growth of debt. And you'll be aware that the Bible is extremely hostile to debt. The borrower is the slave of the lender, and indeed the Greeks feel as if they're now slaves and servants of the Germans. But even at a personal level, the borrower is the slave of the lender. So we need a growth strategy which is not dependent on the euro, is not dependent on debt, and we need to find ways of stopping the growth of national, corporate, and personal debt. So I suppose the issue is whether one sees the EU ultimately as a single state, whether you see it as a constellation, like looking up at the sky and seeing bright stars and smaller stars, but they don't seem to be intrinsically connected to one another. So is it meant to be a state or a constellation, or are we looking at it more as a club, as a group of nations that come together with their own distinctive identities to provide mutual support and to work together in certain key ways, such as controlling their external borders and their internal security and so on, in order to make them a more cohesive unit than they would be separately. So that's the kind of choices we think that lie ahead. Are you finishing at this point? Cool.
So I think from a Christian perspective we have to accept God is sovereign over nations. Nations are built into the fabric of the New Jerusalem. These are not temporary institutions of a fallen world. However, that doesn't mean to say that nations cannot cooperate and be integrated for peaceful purposes, and so there may be perfectly legitimate grounds for some degree of sharing and cooperation. But I think, from my and Michael's perspective, the idea of the push to abolish the nation state is a flawed one. The key problem that Europe has, this slipway problem, is the euro. It will only work with single debt issuance, single banking regulation, single tax raising authority, and there is just no political sort of willingness to concede those in most or many countries. And even if a country decided to agree to that at one point, to believe that the support for that would be intergenerational is a strong one. And so therefore you have to start thinking about how can you allow countries to exit the euro. Incredibly technically and legally difficult. So that's the real concern. The hole is very hard to dig oneself out of. And so there is a Christian role for prayer, for peace building, for trying to overcome these divides in relationships. And so the motivation of the paper was to promote that idea.